we're going to go ahead and go on to item number G, City Manager's Comments Update on City Operations. Mr. Olson?
Thank you, Mayor. We have only one report today, but it's an important one. It's a status on our water system, and I've asked Mark Van Vleck, our Executive Director of Utilities, to come in and give you that report.
Good morning. Again, Mark Van Vleck, Executive Director of Utilities. As part of today's update, I'd like to provide a little background information on what happened and what is happening. And I'm going to start essentially with what we use as a disinfectant. In order to protect the city's pipes against harmful bacteria, we use a disinfectant. This disinfectant acts similar to our immune system. It attacks and destroys harmful bacteria that may enter the system in one way or another. We use chloramines, which is a mixture of chlorine with ammonia, which contains nitrogen as our normal disinfectant. As I go through this discussion, nitrogen is going to become an important element. We use this disinfectant because it generates less taste and odor complaints, and for those of you that may be hearing the complaints about our chlorine right now, that is one of the side effects of using the current disinfectant. It lasts longer in the system also. Okay. It also leaves a thin biofilm. This biofilm protects the pipes against corrosion, reduces dirty water complaints, and extends the life of the pipes. Have you ever crossed a stream and you stepped on a rock that was slippery from kind of a film on it? Okay. Well, this film is what is inside the pipe, essentially lining the pipe. You want it there, but you don't want it very thick. You just want a very light coating. If you buy fertilizer, the first number shown on the bag describes the amount of nitrogen. Okay? The nitrogen is critical for the health and growth of your plants. This nitrogen also releases over time. You need water and time for this nitrogen to be released. This biofilm behaves similar to your plants. It needs this nitrogen to survive. Okay? Like the plants need the nitrogen to survive. Over time, the nitrogen in the chloramine is released from the mixture. Okay? Please remember that chloramines are the chlorine-ammonia mixture that contains the nitrogen that we normally use as a disinfectant. Okay? So chloramines are the ones that have the nitrogen with it. What we're on currently does not have any nitrogen in it, and I'm going to explain why that is critical. The time is dependent that it takes to release is dependent on the temperature of the water. It's going to release over time no matter what, but it increases the rate at which it breaks down faster as the temperature of the water goes up. When the water is flowing normally, this release rate of the nitrogen and the thickness of the film stay in balance. If the temperature is higher and the water doesn't move as fast, the nitrogen can start releasing faster than we want it to. That is why we keep saying that this is occurring because of lower demands. In other words, the water isn't moving as fast, and high temperature, because it's essentially decaying, releasing the nitrogen faster than we want, and the water is not moving as fast as we want. Okay? If the film becomes thicker, this biofilm, it needs more nitrogen to live. Okay? Kind of like your plants. If they get bigger, they need more nitrogen, and it just keeps going. Okay? Lower chlorine residuals may be an indication. Let me go back. So if the film becomes, it also creates a place for the harmful bacteria to hide. So as it gets thicker, harmful bacteria, as it gets in the system, can actually hide in this biofilm so that your disinfectant isn't able to kill the harmful bacteria. Okay. Lower chlorine residuals may be an indication that the biofilm is beginning to grow. Okay. But it may also be an indication that there's a closed valve which is creating a dead end. In other words, the water is not moving at all because you've closed a valve where the water should be moving. Okay. If it continues growing, there's a point at which it starts breaking down the chloramine so that it can feed on nitrogen. In other words, this biofilm no longer depends on time. It itself is forcing the breakdown of the chloramine, freeing up the nitrogen so it can feed itself. Okay. This would then leave the pipes without their immune system. Okay. To ensure that we are keeping all of this in balance, we have 98 sites scattered throughout the city to monitor how well our immune system is working. When we sample, we expect to find the amount of disinfectant to be above 0.5 milligrams per liter at all sites. Okay. We visit these sites twice a month. A little over a week ago, we started to see lower chlorine residuals in areas that are towards the end of our distribution system. Okay. In a couple of these areas, we found valves that were closed. Okay. After we opened the valves, the area started to respond, but not as fast as we would have liked. We took that to be an indication that the biofilm may be growing and lowering the immune system's ability to fight off the harmful bacteria. Erring on the side of caution, a boil water advisory was issued for those areas. After the advisory was issued, we continued monitoring the areas adjacent to the initial area and other areas that behave similarly. That is why we expanded the areas covered last week. We can then continue monitoring the areas adjacent to these newly defined lines, okay? And we didn't see an increase. It remained at that point. I'm aware of only one way to get the biofilm back under control, and that is to remove it entirely. After you're certain that it is removed, you can go back to chloramines and monitor its growth again. In other words, go back to 0 and then slowly let it grow back to the thin film that you want. We have 2 ways to remove the biofilm. Moving the water very fast so it scours it away, similar to using a power washer. So, in other words, if you can get the water moving fast enough, it almost behaves like a power washer to clean the inside of the pipes. The other way to do it is to starve the biofilm by removing the nitrogen entirely. Go to just chlorine with no nitrogen. In smaller areas, we have been successful in using both of these methods without changing the disinfectant for the entire city. In the case of the areas we identified a little over a week ago, these areas were just too large to do anything other than to change the chlorine disinfectant to the one without nitrogen for the entire city. To that end, we started converting to the alternate disinfectant on Monday of last week. As the disinfectant moved through the system, we monitored at the critical locations. Until we see data that indicates a majority of the biofilm has been removed, we're leaving the areas, the boil water advisory in place for those areas. Please remember, the harmful bacteria can live in this thickened biofilm. It should be killed on contact by the chlorine, but again, erring on this side of caution, we felt that it was better to leave the area covered by a boil water advisory. Given the current data, okay, yesterday we removed a bunch of areas. Given the current data, I believe we'll be removing the boil water advisory for the entire city tomorrow. Okay, I've seen good data essentially for a 24-hour period, but I want to ensure that it's truly is showing that the biofilm is nearly gone before we actually remove for those areas. Okay. In order to ensure that we have removed the biofilm throughout the system, we've begun flushing and testing all of our dead-end mains. This will take us several weeks to make sure that we get through all of them and we confirm that the biofilm has been removed in all of our dead-end mains. That is why we will remain on the alternate disinfection without the nitrogen for 45 to 60 days. Okay. Going forward, in 45 to 60 days, we'll return to using chloramines as a disinfectant. Okay. We are currently planning to remove all the biofilm again by switching to free chlorine in January of 2017. We are now looking at all of the data to see if we should include other events to trigger a switch sooner. In other words, this spring we had very heavy rains, which essentially equated to no one watering at all. Is that a trigger that we should use after a certain number of days of continuous rain? Should that be one of our triggers? We're reviewing that data to see if it should. So, what I'm saying is, although we've said January 2017, if we see that one of the triggers should be after 60 to 90 days of continuous rain, might be an indicator that you should go clean the system by removing all the biofilm, we may do it sooner. Okay. We are using mathematical models to determine if there's a way to decrease the time that water resides in the areas that are towards the end of our distribution system. We're looking at Could be piping, could be how we handle our elevated storage tanks, could be how we handle the pumps at our ground storage. We're modeling all of those to see if there's a way to essentially move water through the ends of our system at a faster rate. Okay. And I stand by to answer any questions that you may have.
We have a couple people for questions. Thank you for the update. And I'm going to ask Mr. Olson if, at the appropriate time working with his team, two things. Number one, to get a strategic plan moving forward, how we plan to be proactive as opposed to reactive to this. And also, if you can get a copy of your information to all the council members,
Yes, ma'am.
that would be helpful. If I can ask Christina to also give me a copy of, I wanted all the council members to have a copy of what I received this morning regarding background information on water system nitrification that Ms. Womack worked with you all. If we can, I sent an email out on that, so Christina, if you're listening, if you can get a copy out to the council members now, that'd be great. And also, if you can come back and with your strategic plan and when that's ready at the appropriate time, make a presentation to the public as well, because it's important for them to know the path moving forward. Ms. McIntyre?
Thank you. Well, you preempted most of my questions right at the very end when you said we're going to switch to chlorine. So when you say switch, it means that's a permanent switch, not just the annual chlorine burn or anything. You're talking about a permanent switch from chloramine to free chlorine.
No, ma'am.
Okay, what are you saying?
And the reason we don't stay on free chlorine permanently, among other things, is have you ever used bleach to clean something plastic? Mm-hmm. What happened to the plastic? It can over time disintegrate. Well, the free chlorine is bleach. Many of our pipes are plastic. Okay, so you really do need this biofilm to protect that plastic from the chlorine. Okay, so and if you go while we're in free chlorine, essentially you're exposing that plastic to the bleach. So it's the life expectancy of your pipes is decreased by going on free chlorine. So I'm not recommending that we go away from chloramines. Okay, what I am recommending is that from time to time, so that we know the thickness of that biofilm, we go back onto essentially the bleach to clean it off and then reestablish the baseline.
So when you said switch in January 2017 or earlier,
for another 45 to 60 days.
Okay, thank you.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'll clarify that.
Okay. So for
Yes,
45
ma'am.
to 60 days again, but on a periodic routine rather than when we see low chlorine somewhere.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, great. A couple of other questions. First off, so valves were closed. How does that happen?
Multiple ways. Sometimes it's because we are trying to move water in a different way. Sometimes it's when we've went and repaired a main break, and we may not get them all open, and you may not see it because all the pressures are adequate everywhere around it. It's feeding. The area is still getting plenty of pressure. It's still getting fresh water, but over time, you can get it so that it starts becoming more stagnant, which is where you could start having the biofilm start to grow, and then once it starts to grow, it can start expanding.
So when a valve gets closed for service or maintenance, or because we purposely try to, is there any documentation of of all the valves we have and whether they're in open or closed state so that people can tell immediately?
Where we're reviewing that data, yes, there is supposed to be. Okay, but the other thing that very frequently happens is if it's a long main break, I may have 2 or 3 crews. So it may be essentially on the log of the initial crew, and the second crew may be the one that comes on, and they think they have them all. Okay, but we're working on a process to address that.
So there's a log of valves as opposed to log of crews.
That's correct.
Okay.
And I would love to say that we will never encounter this, but I've had this discussion with every other utility director in the state, and none of us have cracked the code on how to ensure that all valves are open when they're supposed to be. I wish I could figure out a way to do that, as do the rest of them, but we're going to do our best.
And the pressure readers aren't at each valve so that you can see the pressure right there?
No, ma'am.
They're in different
No.
places. Okay. Okay. So the twice a month testing, and you know, at each location. So I guess I'm trying to think of in a general area. If you take a large area, so how often, if you were to take an area like one of the areas, like the South Shores, you know, Airline, Ocean Drive, Alameda, Ennis Jocelyn, the last area remaining in the boil.
Yes, ma'am.
How often would something in that area be tested?
At a minimum, every other week.
Minimum, okay.
And there's actually 2 in that area.
Okay.
And so if they were offset, there could be essentially something every week. Okay, and I haven't had a chance to go through the data, but at a minimum, it would be every other week.
And I know if we're going to do the free chlorine periodically based on the biofilm, then that helps. But is there also, if it's related to flow and temperature, is there perhaps a need during those times that we know we have low flow and high temperatures to increase the testing from once a month to once every 2 weeks or 3 weeks, because we know we're at a higher risk? Or is the chlorine burn enough to decrease that risk?
The key is we can do that, but the other part is the answer then becomes still to go to a free chlorine,
Still have to do it.
starving of the biofilm.
Right.
Okay, so what we're really pursuing is, given those scenarios, is there something else related to that would automatically tell us, don't need to increase testing, we just need to go to this solution?
Right, and what I was thinking about the testing increases is how rapidly does it drop? So that if you you look at for below 0.5, so if you went out a month before it's above 0.5, and a month later it's below 0.5, but is there a point in there that you can see it dropping, but it's still safe enough to be able to make a less impactful change to the system?
And that's exactly the data we're looking at right now. Is the answer to increase? Is there a trigger point that is higher than 0.5 that we should be looking at? And all of that is the data that we're looking at right now to see where those triggers should be.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Ms. McIntyre. Mr. Scott?
So, Mark, there's a reason I was a business major in college. There's a number of reasons. One of which, there is no word in the College of Business that starts with the letters B-I-O, bio. I don't understand anything when you start talking about biology. So, I have, along the way, decided not to comprehend what you're saying, but I do think a couple things. And I thought about my comments, and I want to start with this. I ordered some shirts recently, and Ron and I were talking. I said I ordered shirts that have the City of Corpus Christi logo because I love the organization. I love being associated with the City of Corpus Christi, and I'm prideful in the ability to wear a shirt, which I pay for, that says City of Corpus Christi. The recent events don't make me prideful. I think it's a reasonable expectation that the citizens not have to go through this. And I understand, I appreciate the explanation, but I also think it's reasonable for our citizens to be more like me than you and not need to understand the explanation. They just shouldn't go through this. My sense is that other communities don't go through this, and maybe they do, and I'm fine if you want to explain that, but we, with the exception of the one 7 or 9 years ago, we haven't been through it. So I think evidence is on my side that this doesn't happen and shouldn't happen. But I appreciate you, and so what I want to just reiterate to you is I'm going to trust that you're going to go have a conversation with the smart people, and that you're going to create a system that doesn't happen again. But I wouldn't say it unless you brought it up today, but I don't want the moment to pass without telling you I'm deeply disappointed that we're going through this, and I think it impacts the community in very significant ways that aren't necessarily life-changing significance, but impacts their perception of everything we do. And you and I would say, well, that shouldn't happen, but it does. And so this is a big deal to me. I appreciate the explanation, and I'm hopeful it doesn't happen again, and I'm going to trust that you guys and girls are going to create a system where it doesn't happen again, and I'm hopeful that if it costs $1 today to run the system, and if it takes $1 and a penny tomorrow, so it doesn't happen again, don't not do it. You know, have a conversation with us. And then the only thing I have is I get a lot of questions on the smells and the odors. That's the free chlorine, and that will end when generally?
About 45 days from now.
Okay. I felt bad just as an anecdote. I was in jury duty yesterday, and a lady was sitting beside me chewing me out about the water boil, and I went, "Hey, look, no, we just lifted it," and showed her the picture. And she goes, "Well, what's that one area?" Well, that happened to be the area she lives in, so that didn't go well for me. But that was her big complaint, was the odor and the smell. So it's still 45 days before that's resolved, and then it'll happen again in February. That happens
January
normally?
of 2017.
And that happens normally? We do that?
No, we don't.
Okay, that's me not listening. I'm sorry.
No,
So-
we do not. We've historically just watched the data without a planned
Okay,
moving
that's
it
right.
forward.
All right, so because I thought you were going to say, "No, Mark, we do it every year," and that would tell me that I've just haven't been paying attention and that we have that odor in the system. But you're telling me we don't normally have that odor. We're going to have it for another 45 days, and as my grandfather would say, God willing, the creek don't rise. We won't have to deal with it until, I guess, January of next year.
2017.
17. All right. Thank you, Ron.
Can I address your one there? Other communities do experience this, but they rarely issue boil water advisories when associated with this. We felt, that with public health and safety, we knew that when you're essentially starving this biofilm during that period, and as it grows, it can generate a potential hazard. So we issue boil water advisories. Many other communities do not do that. They just immediately go to the alternate disinfection, and without really telling their citizens anything other than, we're going to a new alternate disinfection.
Well, that would be important to note. So if there's 5 cities that have done this in the last 12 months, that would be nice. That would be nice for us to know, because we can go, oh, well, actually, because we don't know. We just know we've gone through 2 water boils in the last 6 months. And so if you could say, no, actually 5 cities have done this in the last 12 months, then that's what we can relay when people say, what they're saying.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Ms. Rubio?
Well, first of all, thank you for the information. I did get a phone call from a gentleman that was very concerned, because you know how social media is Facebook. And on Facebook, there was a gentleman who was planning to file a potential lawsuit, because he says that the city has not been able to take care of our water, and there's a lot of chlorine in it, and it's going to hurt when he showers. And he's thinking that because we're having to keep those boil water, that we also potentially could have parasites in the water, and that's why you're having to use a lot of chlorine. So this is just on social media. I just want you to know that it's out there. But when you mentioned, when we talked about, or when Councilwoman McIntyre talked about the closed valves, I'm not an engineer. I don't pretend that I'm an engineer, but it just seems very strange to me that if you're out there doing a job, you should have a checklist to make sure that those valves are opened again. I mean, to me, that's almost a very simple solution. I don't really care how many crews are out there, but they all should be doing the same thing, making sure that their valves are open. And so I don't see it being very complicated, and what I call that is accountability. They need to be held accountable. That should not ever happen. And I take offense when someone doesn't do the job right from the beginning to the end. So I expect better from all of us, because it's very disappointing when I have a reunion and there's a boil water over at Fajitaville, that's where we were. A week later, they come back for another big function, and here we are again in the same situation. So it's a little embarrassing, and so I'm hoping that we can do better and making sure that when we have these kinds of situations, and I'm glad that y'all take care of them, so don't think I don't really care. I know y'all are working hard, but I also feel that we can do better.
Yes, ma'am. And we actually started making strides about a month ago on the valves. It's not just my employees who touch those valves. It's others. And we've, I think, clamped down on all the others who have touched our valves. And I think we're limiting that. And that's the other part is we have other contractors sometimes turn them off and on when they're working on a line next to them. I think we've got it so that now they have to go through us to make that happen.
Okay.
Like any process, we're going to have to keep following it, and because I've noticed with when you change a process, if people still want to do something, they find another alternate route to do what it is that they wanted to do. So we've got to continue chasing to make sure that we close that gap.
Yes, sir.
And we did that a couple weeks ago, I believe, of closing that gap. But we're still going through and trying to figure out where contractors had worked and going and checking those locations to make sure all the valves are open. Okay, so, and we were in process of doing that when this occurred.
Okay. It's just holding everyone, no matter who touches our pipes, accountable.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Rubio. Mr. McGill?
Thank you, Mayor. I couldn't agree more with you, Mayor, in terms of developing a strategic plan. Having that plan helps you be more proactive. And I hear a lot of good information, obviously, 98 sites that you're monitoring, and you have been monitoring twice a month. And so erring on the side of caution for public health and safety, issuing the water boil, I believe was the right decision. It is embarrassing. It is something that pulls us from the policy mindset into the accountability mindset. And having a plan in place helps you address those issues and be more proactive. So the two ways that I think you've mentioned how the nitrification happens is from both heat and conservation, or
Right.
the slowdown of the water
The
moving through the system. I gather from a January number or a January time frame, you're not going to get a lot of heat. So what's the thinking there? Is it mainly just in timing from this free chlorine burn, or what's the thinking in January? Because there's probably, I mean, granted, we're in South Texas, so I just
The
don't see
key
100
is
degree temperatures.
actually you'll have less taste and odor complaints. Okay, during that time frame because the temperature is lower and the chlorine isn't freeing up. Okay, as fast.
Okay.
Plus, the free chlorine residual actually stays stronger all the way through, so you might be able to go for less time to clean it. But the key reason there is essentially because you'll be able to move it through quicker, and the heat is also part of what causes the taste and
Dissipation.
odor complaints
Okay.
related to the chlorine, the free
Okay.
chlorine.
And so when you mentioned bleach, that's sodium hypochlorite. We
Yes.
already have it in our purchasing program within the water department. Is this the budget that's affected, or how does
No,
how does the
we
pay-
actually use chlorine
Okay.
that is comes in tank cars, rail cars, at the treatment plant. So we use chlorine, but what we do then is we add ammonia to it before it goes into the system.
Okay. You mentioned bleach earlier. I got confused. there.
Well, the key is when you're on just chlorine, it behaves like bleach does on plastic.
Okay. So that was an analogy.
Yes.
Okay. Understood. Okay. And then obviously, we're talking about other people touching valves and having a more controlled environment, so you can regulate that. That reminds me of our design standards for streets when we went through a utility cut policy. That could be a policy decision. I don't know if that needs to come to us, but to me, that's more policy based. And
Yeah.
frankly, touching those valves has an impact, obviously, on our city.
I think I issued that policy about a month ago.
Okay.
Once I found out what was going on. So that policy is in place now,
Okay.
but we still need to monitor it.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is you're monitoring 98 sites as normal twice a month. You're going through the free chlorine burn right now, 45 to 60 days for that to kind of effectively burn off. We go back to chloramines. January 2017, we're scheduling a tentative free chlorine burn again, although that may change a little bit because of heat and or if you're seeing some fluctuations in that 0.5 milligrams per liter. And you're developing a strategic plan to prevent from this happening again.
Yes.
Okay.
And I would prefer that we are not burning the system. What we are doing is starving the biofilm.
Right.
Okay?
You're not providing nitrogen.
No one I've heard is getting burnt, okay, from taking their shower or doing anything in relation to this water. Okay. What we're doing is we're removing the nitrogen and we're starving the biofilm.
Okay.
Okay.
Better
I'm
use
sorry.
of
I'm sorry for
terminology.
the
No, I
clarification there,
appreciate
but
that.
I'm hearing people thinking that they're going to get burnt from this chlorine. No,
Okay.
that's not what's
That's
going
a
to
better
occur.
use of terminology. And my last comment is, I wish you, Mark Van Vleck, were my chemistry teacher in high school, because I'm starting to understand chemistry better than I think I ever have. But I will say this, our citizens shouldn't have to understand chemistry to feel safe with their water system. So I'm going to be particularly interested in the plan that you developed to prevent from this happening again. I appreciate you taking ownership of the issues, as you always have, and making sure that it's getting taken care of. So I appreciate that, and I appreciate all your work. So thank you. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. McGill. Mrs. Vaughn?
I would think that it would be kind of like swimming in a pool with chlorine. I'm not making light of it,
Right.
but people do that all the time.
Yes, ma'am.
So I want to thank you for your hard work, because I think you've been under the gun for a month or so with all the issues that we've had, and I appreciate that. But I also, the thoughts that Councilman Scott had, I had the same feelings, because I don't want the public to lose confidence in us either. But I also think it's better to be safe than sorry, and I want to commend you for telling the truth. I mean, there are adults out there, and they need to know what is actually going on, and I appreciate you doing that. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Okay, we have a public comment. We approximately at noon, but this is the furthest we've gotten from it. But it was a very important subject to talk about. But Mr. Van Vleck, I will tell you that everybody learns differently, and I respect the different comments on how people take in information. But I'm one of those that want to know the details. I want to know the whys and the hows, and equals what. And so it's helpful to have this information for me to better understand it, and then I can make my own encapsulation, but also to be receptive and responsive to every single phone call and email that we all get. So thank you for this, and appreciate all of your hard work.